want to mention that the cases we're highlighting have received international attention. The Alabbasi family, that disappearance, the kidnapping, was taken and used by the Amnesty International. And Dr. KamAlmaz, his case received national attention on Fox News and CBS Morning News. Our first speaker is Naila Alabbasi. She is a sister of Rania Alabbasi and an obstetrician and gynecologist consultant, and is working in the Kingdom Hospital in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and she joins us from Saudi Arabia. Naila Alabbasi.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank Promoting Enduring Peace and Mr. Stanley in particular for putting this event together today to talk about my sister Rania Alabbasi and her family. And I'd like to thank everyone joining us as well. During Syria's 11 years of revolution, many stories of forced disappearances and those who were arbitrarily detained have emerged. However, the story of my sister is one of the most ominous. It began with Rania's husband, Abdurrahman Yassin, who was born on 1969, who was arrested by members of military who wore military uniforms from his home in the Dumar district of Damascus. On March 9, 2013, the next day, security forces returned to his home again, with him looting all the gold and money in the house, as well as seizing 3 cars, computers, mobile phones, along with the passports and documents proving their properties. The following day, March 11, 2013, security forces arrested Rania with her 6 children and her secretary, Majduleen Al-Qadi, who was born on 1984, who was in her house that day by chance. Rania's children were 13, 12, 11, 8, 6, and 1.5 years old at the time of the arrest. Their names are Dima, Intisar, Najah, Ala, Ahmed, and Layan. One of the men who stormed her home along with a member of the security forces named Abu Kazim had been a patient of Rania's at her own clinic. Even he was treated for free of charge. The reason for their arrest is still unknown. However, we believe that Abdurrahman may have been targeted because he had provided humanitarian assistance to people in need. Some of them have been related to Free Arm without his knowledge. The Syrian authorities have not been provided any information to us, nor to other bodies such as the UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. The first news of them we have received 8 months after Rania's arrest, when one of the released detainees, who was also a doctor, told that one of the officers in the military security branch 215 mentioned Rania by name during the first 15 days of Rania's arrest, and that she could hear the voices of children crying with her. Later, we received the news that she was seen in military security branch 235, which is called Palestine branch, in 2014, along with her kids. The kids were then the kids were taken to orphanages. Rania, who was born in Damascus 1970, was a professional dentist specialized in periodontics. Rania was an example to me. She always encouraged me in my study. At the age of 15, Rania participated in National Chess Championship and was crowned champion for 10 consecutive years, joining regional chess tournament, winning the Arab Championship and ranking 5th in the East Asian Championship. She later gained an international rating from the International Chess Federation. Rania raised the profile of Syria and was honored by Bashar al-Assad, the older brother of Bashar al-Assad at that time. She was named as the best Syrian player ever. Our father was detained in 1980 when Rania was 10 years old. as arbitrary detention without any reason during the rule of Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad. Then he was released on 1993 because of incurable disease. When Rania was 23 years old, on 1995, Rania quit chess to travel to Saudi Arabia with my parents, which she worked in as a dentist for 13 years. She was very popular among her patients and her colleagues because she was energetic, honest, and very good in her job and successful. In spite, Rania was busy with her work and children. She was social, always make time for her relatives and friends. She was kind, generous, and always thinking in other, even for everyone in needs help. All of my family were living in Saudi Arabia, but Rania decided to go back Syria to raise her kids in their home. She started her own clinic in Damascus before the start of the war. When the revolution began in 2011, the whole family had visa to leave Syria to Saudi Arabia. Even Rania's husband had valid residency there. We asked Rania to join us, but she refused to leave Syria. She told me society needs me. I want to raise my kids in my home and to complete their education. She thought she and her family were safe, especially she did not participate in any political activities or belong to any oppositional party, or even she did not go to any demonstration. She was a busy doctor and a mother of 6 children. She had no time to do so. The 6 children had done nothing. Rania and her husband raised them with love and care. Their dreams was sending them to the best university and achieving the highest standard of education. The beautiful girls were full of life and energy. They liked to have fun with their friends, dancing, singing, acting, joining parties, dressing, visiting bars, practicing sport, achieving high scores in school. Dima, the oldest one, was very shy and sensitive. Intisar was very clever with strong personality. Najah was lovely and friendly girl. Ala was very beautiful, like an angel. I cannot forget the time of her delivery. I am the one who conducted the delivery for her and Ahmed as well. Ahmed also was the only boy Rania was have. He was very energetic. Layan, the youngest one, who was born in 2011 during the war. Actually, we don't have the time, the chance to see her. She was in Syria at that time. All of them were having social media account and their own laptop. They were able to communicate with their friends privately. Their parents gave them the trust, self-confidence, support, and ability to express themselves freely. What we have done. First, we documented Rania and her family's arrest to a Karama group on enforced and involuntary disappearances related to United Nations and human rights. We created a page in Facebook named The Arrest of Chess Champion Dr. Naila Alabbasi and her children. We were desperate for any information of them, so whoever we have told about a potential middleman, we was asking them, such as policeman, lawyer, businessman, or even lawmaker. They demanded steep fees to dig up information about Rania's family, reduce their sentence, and obtain their release. The scammers pocket the money, stop answering phone calls later. We end up paying a huge amount of money to intermediators close to the Syrian government and bribing officers, no avail. This is called black market, created by the policy of silence of the government on the fate of the detainees. On the other hand, Rania and her children's name were included, as we have told many times, in negotiations conducted between the Free Army and the regime for the prisoners' exchange. However, the regime refused to and excluded their names from the exchange for unknown reason. That's why we're really afraid about their fate. We're afraid that one of them had been killed or as human rights declared that children have not been spared the horror and torture in detention. So we need to act quickly to save and release the ones who still struggle to survive during this long time of detention. Then later we turned to human rights organizations and international bodies. In 2015, I participated with Amnesty International group who launched a big campaign to reveal Rania's and her family's fate. Amnesty urged Syrian authority to release the 6 children unconditionally, release Rania and Abdulrahman Yassin unless they are charged promptly with an internationally recognized offense and tried in accordance with international fair trial standards, reveal the fate of and whereabouts of the whole family and grant them access to their family and a lawyer, ensure that they are protected from any torture and ill treatment and receive any medical attention they may require. But up till now, no response. In 2018, in the meeting of the Syrian government, representatives of the Syrian government and some armed opposition groups in the Kazakh capital Astana, the last asked Assad regime through the international mediator Steven de Mistura to give any information about the whole family, but the regime denied and did not respond. What's more, we looked for the children in SOS Children Village in Syria called Save Our Smile Village or orphanages, because there were many similar stories, which was found that the children were kept in orphanages, isolated from outside world, but we couldn't reach any of them. Also, Amnesty International Group Boston launched one page called Free Naila Alabbasi on Facebook in 2021. Recently, the US Embassy Syria asked for immediate release of Rania with 6 children, but still no response. We change even our Facebook profile every 13th of new month to remind of Rania. This is recently we are doing. My whole family was affected by the arrest. It was a shock to all of us, especially to my parents. We could not sleep at night. Every night I heard my mother, who is an old lady, crying and praying to God for Rania and her children release. Especially she was the one who took care of the kids while Rania was at her work. My mother is sick since that sad day of Rania's arrest. She never leaves the house, always depressed and sad. We miss them. We miss them a lot. Even we wish that we can see them at least in our dreams when we go to bed. My thoughts do not leave me. Is Rania alive? What about the kids? Are they hungry, sick, crying? Very bad feeling, full of angeriness, and despair. Today, more than 9 years passed in which the regime stole their childhood and life. They grow up in its jail infamous for torture. I cannot imagine locking them up during this crucial years, which is a transitional time period from child to adolescent to woman, while facing violence, displacement, lack of access to essential services, hunger, starvation, torture, or may face sexual assault or harassment, depriving from learning and education, physically and emotionally traumatized. What about Layan, the youngest child? She was too young to understand what had happened. She grown up in jail. The period is the time to understand the right and wrong, faith and truth, love and care. It's the time to build their personalities, their self-esteem, their own decision, to be independent, to communicate with others, to choose their friends. I am worried also about their physical health as well, such as vision loss, lease, and escapes are very common in these dirty, crowded cells of prison. Many had acute diarrhea or serious disease, no medicine, no vaccine, no shower, no hygiene, no clean clothes. You have never seen or heard such horror crimes against humanity by Syrian security. What I asked you, all of us know the principle of human rights and the right of child, which is mentioned in Article 37 of the Convention of Rights of Child states, no child should be subjected to torture or other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and no child shall be deprived of his or her liberty unlawfully or arbitrarily. Any child shall have the right to maintain contact with his or her family throughout correspondence and visits. Syria ratified the Convention on Human of Child in 1993 and the Human Rights Convention as well. We as Rania's family believe in international law system. Unenforced disappearance is a crime with international law. I believe that the United States government has a lot of pressure tools through which they can know the fate of Rania's family. I wish to come out of this event meeting, which I thank you again for having me here and offering support and help to come out through this meeting with a team who have a diplomatic ability to move through Western countries who have the influence in Syria file. And we are, as Rania's family, ready to move with a team of diplomats and counselors and lawyers at any time. We really need more collective efforts to achieve or to make a real progress in this case of my sister. And to, as I said, we try to make pressure to the political decision makers in the UN and Security Council as well to push the Syrian regime to reveal their fate and release them. We hope we will end up with their release to try to find a glimmer of light in the dark chapter of their painful memories. I will conclude of Dima handwriting when she was 10 years old. If time passes and we never meet again, this is my handwriting, remember me. We said we never forget you. You are always in our heart and mind. Nothing can give us hope and happiness, only to see you, all of you, again here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Maryam KamAlmaz. She is the daughter of the humanitarian psychotherapist Majd KamAlmaz, a Syrian-American trauma therapist who specialized in treating those affected by conflict and natural disaster around the world. He's been unjustly detained in Syria since February 2017. And Maryam and her family have been advocates for the release of her father. In addition to her advocacy work, and now following in her father's footsteps, she is the co-founder of the nonprofit Be in Peace.
Thank you, Stanley, and thank you for having me. First, my heart goes out to Naila and the horrific situation her family is going through. It's really much more difficult than one can ever imagine. A little bit about my father. My father moved to the United States when he was in elementary school. He came here with his family. He grew up mostly in Little Rock, Arkansas. That's where also he went to school and graduated from college with his psychology degree. At that time, he also started working for an organization called Stepping Stone in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they're used to treat troubled youth that had gone through, abuse, domestic abuse, drug abuse, different types of things. They would call him in the middle of the night. He'd jump up and run out to go see these youth because that was his passion, something he felt very drawn to do, is to help others. Continuing in his education, he felt that he was more needed to treat those that had suffered the worst of the worst. And that's where he started going out to different war zones or countries that had experienced horrific traumatic, like the traumatic incidences like the tsunami in Indonesia, the hurricane in New Orleans, the war in Kosovo and in Bosnia. He would go set up his institution and start going from house to house, knocking on doors, seeing who needed help, who needed treatment, bring the people back to his office, treat them. And so it became something very dear and close to him, that he would always travel and try to help as many people as he could that had suffered the worst situations possible. So of course, when the war in Syria happened, that was, he felt the need to be there for the people as well. And that's why he went to Lebanon. He established his center in Lebanon, International Institute for Psychosocial Development. He used a program called Heart Math, and that was a technique where it was based upon the heart. He taught the refugees how to control their breathing in order to relieve the stress and anxiety that they had gone through. He had also treated so many young children for bedwetting at night. They had a 90% success rate. It was so successful that Heart Math awarded him Humanitarian of the Year award because of his work with the refugees. There was great turnaround with the refugees. They were able to get their lives back together just through the techniques that he was using to treat them. A few months after he received that Humanitarian of the Year award, he decided to go into Syria and see what the situation is in Syria and be there for if anybody needed any sort of help, any sort of therapy, as well as to check on family members. He went into Syria from Lebanon on February 14, 2017. He slept at a family member's house that night. The next morning, he went out on his first trip, and he was stopped at a checkpoint and disappeared. And we don't know anything about him. We haven't heard his voice or been able to contact him ever since that day. It's been over 5 years now. We've sent so many different connections to check on him. We've heard so many different rumors. We've had so many different scammers try to scam us. They've sent us different fake pictures of him that looked like he had aged. His teeth had fallen out. He was very pale, only for us to then discover these were edited Photoshop pictures that weren't accurate. There was a lot that had offered to get him released for a certain amount of money, which we were ready to do, only to find out that it was all a scam as well. We haven't been able to get to him, and it's only made it more difficult. So for the first 2 years of his detainment, we decided to stay private in hopes that the Syrian government would not harm him. We thought we'd protect him by staying private, and there was a higher chance of him being released. However, after 2 years of no success, we decided that it's time for us to reach out to the US government and have them try to do some sort of negotiation for his release. And that's when we decided to go public. We did reach out to different media outlets, to Fox News, CNN, CBS, all of the different news outlets trying to get the word out about his detainment. And luckily, President Trump did take interest in his case. Eventually, at that time, President Trump did send 2 diplomats from the White House, one of them being Roger Carstens, the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, and Kash Patel, a White House official, down to Syria. And that's when they sat with one of the Syrian government's officials, Ali Mamlouk, and they mentioned the American detainees. They didn't provide us with any information. There was no sort of progress out of this meeting. We didn't learn anything new. The Syrian government denied saying anything to help us learn if our father's still alive or not, if he's still well or not, anything about him. We're still in the same hole that we were before they left. Nothing has actually progressed from that meeting. Up until this day, we still don't know anything about him. So my father is a grandfather to 13 children who ask about him all the time. He's an only son to my grandmother, who also calls me almost, every other day. And she says, Maryam, do you think I'll ever hear his voice again? Tell her, I don't know. It's hard to tell. I don't know. Every day is moving by and he's not getting any younger. He's 64 years old now. He's a diabetic. He's had strokes in the past. Although I do know that when he did leave, he was in good health. It's been 5 years and we don't know how his situation is. And it's difficult for us because we're here in the United States and we really don't have anyone in Syria to ask about him besides us trying to find different sort of connections of different people that could go and ask about him. And that hasn't been successful. We're just word of mouth, nothing with actual proof. So till this day, we are in the same boat as Naila's sister and entire family of children and her husband that have disappeared. It's a black hole where families disappear and nobody knows anything about them. The Syrian government will not acknowledge them, will not say, yes, we have this person, will not say what their condition is or how they're living. So it's a very difficult situation to be in. Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's so hard to hear these terrible cruelties put upon people. Our final speaker is Qutaiba Idlbi. He's the representative of the National Coalition for the Syrian Revolution and opposition forces to the United States. He's also a Syria Fellow at the International Center for Transitional Justice, researching the framework of political imprisonment in Syria, and a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, researching economic sanctions and forced displacement. In addition, he is a senior policy advisor to the Syrian Emergency Task Force.
Thank you so much, Stanley, and your team for organizing such an event. It's very hard, of course, to, follow after Maryam and Naila. I'm also grateful to be joined by many familiar faces, legal experts, media professionals, and community activists, a lot of whom are doing also great work on detainees and advocating also for the release of many detainees. And we were also joined by actually a former detainee, Bashar Wanli. I think he left earlier, maybe because because of there's no translation. But also, I think it's great to have all of those people. To put things in context, what I would like to talk about is the context of the stories that we have heard from Maryam and Naila. Usually when people think about the forced disappearance and detention in Syria, we think of, a chaotic way, regime just, snagging people out of the street and just putting them in jail or killing them in a way in a chaotic way that corresponds with the image we usually have about the war. But the reality in Syria is so much different. The whole detention and forced disappearance issue in Syria is actually a systematic way through which the Assad regime of Syria punishes, its own people, its, opponents, and the networks that surround them. So not only people who, would generally oppose the regime or activists or politicians, but also people who just stand on the side, because for the Assad regime, if you're not with us, you're against us. And that's how we saw from the beginning of the conflict how the whole Syrian population became an enemy of the Assad regime, because they either didn't want him in power, or they didn't stood by his side to defend his wealth and his family and his power. And when we look at that system, so it's important to look at this system as with combined punishment. So there is one part where the Assad regime punishes detainees themselves. So we have a clear system of detention that was actually early established in the 1960s with supervision from a French German officer with the name of Alois Brunner, who was actually one of the founders of the SS Nazi battalion. He escaped Germany, went to Egypt, and then found safe haven in Syria under the Assad regime, and was a government advisor until late 2009. And what Alois Brunner basically helped make the system of torture and detention more efficient for the Assad regime. So what we see, through so many interviews, with witnesses, with defected officers, is that this chaotic image that we have does not exist. When detainees are taken in, usually officers do an assessment depending on the detainee himself, their physical, build, which level of torture they should start with, because they don't want to waste time, just beating, for example, for someone well built up. They don't want to waste time using things that might not affect them. But also they, through the tools that they have used in torture, we see a sense of, a bureaucracy in terms of, documenting every single name that was detained, having cleared the Caesar pictures that were released in 2015 showed us that the regime not only document detaining people, but also document with pictures, killing people under torture, keeping basically names and numbers, where those people were killed, which branch was responsible, and where they were taken after. So also it gives us an idea about the second part, which I'll come into. But basically, there was a clear system through which the regime was taking people and torturing them. One part, of course, for getting information, but also another part to create this fear among Syrians that anyone who would, have the courage to stand for the Assad regime, or even stand on the side, not do anything, will be faced with this punishment. And we've seen that to the extent. I was in Syria in 2011, and I remember in the early days of the uprising, people would say, if you go out to demonstration, you might be killed, but worse, you might be actually detained and tortured. Because for many Syrians, detention was actually a worse punishment than even killing. On the other part of this system that we have seen is a punishment for the families themselves. And this is what we are hearing from Maryam and Naila. So we've seen detainees who are men and women from different ages. With the Abbasi family, we've seen detainees as young as 8 or 9 years old. We have seen cases actually of pregnant women who delivered even inside prison. We've seen with a former case we had a 2 years old, or 1 year and 8 months old baby who was detained for 6 months with his mother and father by the Assad regime. No age, no medical restriction will prevent the Assad regime from going further. And of course, in addition to the torture tools that were developed with the help of this Nazi officer, the Assad regime uses everything as its hands as tools for torture. So starvation was used, overcrowding prisons to the extent that detainees would have to take shifts in just sitting on the ground itself, because there is no place even for people to sit. The lack of medical attention, but also when a huge part is kind of making this disconnect between the world of detainees themselves and their families outside. And this is this other part of the punishment that we talk about, which is the punishment for the, families. What the Assad regime sees as a punishment for the families or Syrians themselves is by creating this disconnect, by making it hard for families to get, information. So the Assad regime intentionally does not create even though they have the full information on where detainees are, whether they're dead or alive, of their medical situation, everything. And actually recently, with the help of the Iranian government and some help of some European government, the Syrian intelligence actually was able to bring technology in to make the system actually more efficient. So instead of using paper record, now they have electronic records. So it takes, officers like Ali Mamlouk or, some people like the president himself, just literally 10 seconds to figure out where a certain detainee in. But again, like the lack of information and preventing families to access information is part of the punishment itself, because the Assad regime wants to tell people like, you need, if you think of standing up against me, this is the fate that you're going to face. Not only that, your relatives might be killed, but they want actually Syrians and families of detainees to live through this experience where they actually never know whether their relatives are dead or alive, because they don't want to bring them the peace of having that knowledge. As you're showing here, very quickly, and these are some of the methods that the Assad regime using inside prison. And although many of those are graphic, it's important for us to really look at those images, see what it is like, to visualize the experience those are going through. And again, this is not just the experience of detention itself, not the experience of torture itself, not only the experience of the families waiting outside, not knowing what's happening. It's this whole experience is combined is what the Assad regime has been doing to punish the Syrian people. Again, not only for asking for their basic rights, but also for those who even stood on the side and preferred their own safety and didn't stand up for the Assad regime. Where does that put us as as international actors, as people in the West, as Syrians themselves outside? The risk of what the Assad regime is doing is not only about Syria itself. The risk is that the Assad regime is actually normalizing the use of and the violations of all human rights conventions, of the UN Charter itself, of the different Geneva communiques that were established in the 20th century. The Assad regime is normalizing all of those violations by actually not having a serious response from the international community. If we allow the Assad regime to continue doing the things that they are doing, other dictators and other governments, whether it is in the region or in other places, they would feel obliged, if not, they would feel it's okay for them to actually use the same methods. And from experience, we sometimes think, I think in the United States, that Syria is too far from us. But the experience of, the KamAlmaz family, the experience of the Abbasis, experience of, Ostentized, the Leila Shweikani, and many others, at least 59 Americans, showed us that actually Syria is not too far from us. And if we get to the level where the actions of the Assad regime are normalized, we are not safe then anywhere we go. Because the case of, specifically those cases, it is showing that even when, dual citizens or even American citizens are being taken, detained, tortured, and held with no information, that there is no response from our side, that it is okay for the Assad regime to do so. And then we never know when, China would think it's okay to do such a thing. Iran already thinks it's okay. North Korea already thinks it's okay. So we never know when this will expand to other countries because they feel they can do such a thing without any response from our side. So this is the main danger why it is really important for us to focus on this issue. Again, not only because, and it's weird to say that, not only because it's not okay to hold, children, starting with the age of 8 years old in prison for almost 10 years now. That shouldn't be, the bar we're holding. And it's unfortunate that this is currently the bar, that we're just even asking for children in the Assad regime. And many officials are not, responding to put enough pressure on the Assad regime to release the children. But the bar should be that this whole system should not exist by itself, because it is allowing the normalization of the violations the violation of the norms that we all as an international community, as inhabitant of this planet, we agreed that they're not acceptable. Where we go, of course, from there, and this is where I'm gonna end, of course, we always wonder, okay, this is relatable to us. What can we do here? Each one of us in our own circles, there's, it's always good to think of the small things that are sustainable that we could do. And again, I refer back, I'm seeing here different people working on different pieces, whether it is the legal part, the media part, the social media, the community organization. Each one of us can look around themselves and see, and again, the part you are doing, you, Stanley, are doing, with your team, and advocating for this or shedding the light on this. Each one of us can actually look around and see where they can actually fit in within, serving the release of, the Abbasi family, Dr. Majd KamAlmaz and others, and ending this system, whether it is reaching out to people, reaching out to your local officials and asking them, what have they been doing to secure the release of Rania Abbasi and her family and Dr. Majd KamAlmaz? Reaching out to your local community, sending or echoing the messages you hear here, inviting the families to speak about the experiences, to connect with wider communities. Because if we, as experts, as people who work on this on a daily basis, if we're the only ones who are echoing the message, we're not going to be able to make the necessary change. The real heroes in all of this story, in all of those stories and the successful stories of the release of detainees, is actually each single individual, the likes of you listening here, taking their own part and delivering the message and making this small change in the circles where they are effective to make sure that we have Majd KamAlmaz back, we have Rania Abbasi back, and all the Abbasi children.
Thank you so much for those excellent remarks. In a moment, we'll go to questions. But first, so this is the real thing. We want to brainstorm, to try to think of ideas, maybe things that worked in other campaigns or things that are completely new. We do have a work group that works on Syria that Amina and myself are heading, so you can join in that. Slogans, memes, hashtags, I didn't spell that exactly right. Demonstrations, or people standing on the road with signs. Artwork, which I'll show you a couple examples in a minute. Music, songs, boycotts, and then gaining solidarity for other causes, particularly Ukraine, where we know Ukrainians and Syrians have some of the same enemies. Here's an example of artwork that was just done by a woman named, ironically, her name is Shireen. And this was done just a couple of days ago. A good friend of ours is Mark Nelson, and he did, I asked him if he could do a picture, and he did this for us. And then I put some of these slogans over on the right, or words. So, those things are also important. So let me now. I have to move it so I can stop the share. Okay, finally. Okay, if you would like to say something, ask a question, or if you have an idea, if you could put it in the, if you could put your name in the chat. And I'm also going to put the email for our organization, peace.org, to contact us, to volunteer, to get on our Syria work group, etc. So we have the first question from Dylan Connor.
Hello. Thanks, Stanley, for this important event. And thanks for everyone who's shared their stories and wisdom. I have two questions. I think it might be for Qutaiba. One is, why is the US government, particularly I guess now the Biden administration, choosing not to respond in terms of our American citizens who are imprisoned by Assad? I'm not sure what benefit that has, and I'm confused by it. What's the lack of will there? Second question, what benefit does documenting the atrocities serve the Assad regime? So the Assad regime, we know, has been documenting its crimes with, obviously with the Caesar photos, that's very evident. What benefit does that have besides incriminating themselves? Those are my two questions.
Stanley, would you like me to address the questions? Okay. So in terms of the first question, I think number one, as American citizens, this is a question we should ask American officials every single day. I'll try to answer as much as I can, but at the end of the day, American officials are accountable to us as American citizens. And those questions should definitely be asked to them, and not having those questions pushed to them publicly and privately is allowing the sense of, the sense of relaxation in dealing, with the issues of Americans being detained abroad. The main thing, the problem is with engaging specifically on American detainees being held in Syria is the lack of political will to work on the Syria file in general or anything related to it. We've seen that on different phases, but specifically with the current administration, there is a sense that, the Middle East in general and Syria in specific is only bringing bad attention to the political administration in the US. So as less as possible as, they can engage on Syria, the better it is. So of course, putting more attention, on American detainees who are being held in Syria goes against the political goals of this administration in terms of foreign policy regarding the region, which is very unfortunate because, and again, this is not, unfortunately, we haven't only seen this now, we've seen it with the case of the first American to be taken in Syria was Austin Tice in 2012. We haven't started engaging on Austin Tice until probably 2015. After Austin Tice, there was, in 2012 as well, there was Kevin Doss, who was taken end of 2012. We didn't even know that Kevin Doss was detained in Syria until the late British doctor, Dr. Abbas Khan, who was held in Damascus. He told his family that he has an American fellow in the cell with him. And this information cost him his life because as a punishment, the Syrian regime killed Dr. Abbas Khan. And then at the time when his family was supposed to pick him up in Damascus, the regime gave them a dead body and told them like, oh, your son killed himself this morning. So Dr. Abbas Khan, of course, he didn't kill himself. The regime killed him that morning, but he literally sacrificed himself to tell the British government that there's an American citizen, in the cell next to me. And until then, the American government didn't even know that this, US citizen was taken. And so on with the other cases we have seen. There was, of course, later a sense of engagement, depending on the administration. But there wasn't really like any serious engagement, again, to prevent, in the first place, of course, the detention of those people, showing the political will that taking Americans hostage will have actually, high cost, or taking detainees in general. So that is where we are now. And again, our engagement on our side is essential, especially as citizens, in those countries, is very essential to make sure that our government representatives are actually doing what is necessary to secure the release of detainees. On the issue of documentation itself from the Syrian regime, the Syrian regime does that because they act on the fact that one, information is power. So in every single aspect, you want to make sure that, officers on the lower level. So what we have seen before, and I'll give you an example. So the regime wants to make sure that everything is controlled, top bottom, that officers, and they wouldn't trust even their own officers, maybe, to have some good leanings, try to release some detainee from here or there. So this is on one hand. On the other hand, this is what they were taught by, the advisors who helped establish the system. We've seen it with Nuremberg, with the tribunal against the Nazis. The Nazis did the same thing. And basically, Alois Brunner transferred the same experience to the Syrian regime. So on one hand, this is how they know how to do it. On the other hand, the regime wanted to make sure that no one on a lower level would actually, help release detainees, which is what we have been kind of utilizing in the early years of the revolution, trying to talk to different officers and, release whoever we can get out, until the regime was able to get to a point where, they have full control over the system. So today, for example, as groups who try to release detainees under the Assad regime, when we try to reach out to a certain officer, let's say in this intelligence agency, and the certain officer, puts in a search for a specific name, the vice president actually in the National Security Office would get a message that this certain user, which is this officer, is searching for this specific name. And then this officer would start getting questioned, why are you looking for that name? And this was all designed, so for us as family associations, as victims associations, as groups who are trying to help detainees, it was designed to actually prevent us from kind of penetrating the system and getting information about those detainees. Because as I said, hiding information or preventing information from the families is by itself a punishment to not let those families have the peace of knowing whether their relatives are dead or alive.
Thank you.